So, dear friends, I want to thank you again for being willing to be here today and braving the messy weather and carving out enough time in your day to stop. That's one of the difficulties that we have, I think, most of us, probably the world over, is busyness, that we're kept very, very busy and we have trouble stopping. Thich Nhat Hanh says that meditation is not to escape from society, but to come back to ourselves and see what's going on. Once there is seeing, there must be acting. With mindfulness, we know what to do and what not to do. It's not passive sitting in silence, it's sitting in awareness, free from distraction and realizing the clear understanding that arises from concentration. So when we stop, we can have a chance to get some clarity. We can calm our mind, calm our bodies, and think a little bit more clearly, so hopefully we make fewer mistakes. And I wanted to start off today by reading a poem by Thai. It was called Going in Circles. Oh, you who are going in circles, please stop. What are you doing it for? I cannot be without going, because I don't know where to go. That's why I go in circles. Oh, you who are going in circles, please stop. But if I stop going, I'll stop being. Oh, my friend who's going in circles, you are not one with this crazy business of going in circles. You may enjoy going, but not in circles. Where can I go? Go where you can find your beloved, where you can find yourself. So that's our job always. Before we begin anything, we try to stop and come back to ourselves, to breathe and come back to ourselves. So we'll enjoy 3 sounds of the bell. And for those who are using devices to watch this talk, I always suggest that you perhaps would like to just pause your device for a few minutes while you sit and breathe and become fully present so you can enjoy the rest of the talk with us. And so, dear friends, today I wanted to talk a little bit about anger. In the culture that we're living in, it seems like there's a lot of that going around. We're living in a time of a lot of divisiveness. And Thai always tells us to look at the root cause of a problem, to get to the root cause in order to find our way out. And when I look at what's happening in our culture, I see that one of the root causes is we don't recognize our state of interbeing. Thai teaches us that we're all interconnected, inextricably interconnected. And when we lose sight of that and we really think that we're separate from, we can cause a whole lot of suffering for ourselves and everybody else. Thai says the world is not a problem to be solved. It's a living being to which we belong. The world is part of our own self, and we are part of its suffering wholeness. Until we go to the root of our image of separateness, there can be no healing. The deepest part of our separateness from creation lies in our forgetfulness of its sacred nature, which is also our own sacred nature. And so we're always invited to remember our connection. We're invited to remember how sacred this is, or how sacred we are. so that we can develop respect for ourselves, each other, and everybody on the planet and the planet itself, of which we are a part. I love Mother Teresa says, if there is no peace, it's because we've forgotten we belong to each other. And when I look around, I think, yeah, that's what seems to be happening. So our practice is one of mindfulness, so we can remember, to remind ourselves, so we remember that we that we do belong to each other, that we are part of everything. There's a bunch of different things going on, causes and conditions. The Buddha said, when causes and conditions are sufficient, things manifest. When they cease to be sufficient, things don't manifest. So our job as practitioners are to look deeply at the causes and conditions. When things are manifesting that we're not too happy about, then we want to go and do what we can to create other causes and conditions. Like I said, right now, we're living in a time of a lot of divisiveness, and there are people actively watering seeds of hatred and separation in the collective consciousness. So I feel particularly lucky to have a practice of mindfulness where we can actually learn to retrain our minds and be very mindful of what we're taking in, and to look deeply enough to know what to believe and what not to believe, what's true and what's not true. This is a really, really important quality, I think, for us to cultivate. The other thing about understanding causes and conditions is then we're not really shocked or appalled by too much. It's the logical outcome. That Thai says that when we have unwholesome seeds watered in our consciousness, the outcome can be pretty unwholesome. And when we have the wholesome seeds watered in our consciousness, then we can bring the highest and best to our consciousness. And that's what we are contributing to the collective. We're all transmitting and receiving energy every minute of our lives. The quality of the transmission is determined by the quality of our consciousness. The quality of our consciousness is determined by what we're taking in. How are we nourishing our consciousness? So it's not a mystery anymore. It's just the logical outcome. When we look at anger in particular, I like to look and see, okay, what seems to be some of the places where we get caught? If we don't look really deeply enough, we can see that sometimes it's powerlessness. That when we're feeling powerless, a lot of times it brings up anger, the energy of anger in us. And what I can see is that a lot of people, when they get angry and act it out, they feel powerful, that it helps them to feel more powerful. A one-upsmanship, kind of. It doesn't work very well in that it causes a lot of suffering for the people that are on the receiving end. And usually after we have outbursts like that, we don't feel good about ourselves either. And so it usually just stimulates more self-hatred and more anger. So it doesn't really work. One of the places that I see a lot of powerlessness manifest is when we get triggered, and childhood things get triggered in us. That a lot of us were not treated that well, maybe as children, and children are powerless. They don't have a lot of agency. And when children are not treated well, there's a lot of rage that happens. I see that a lot in folks that are adults getting into arguments. When we look deeply at the root of the problem, a lot of times we're carried back to, it triggered some things from our childhood. And we find out that that 3-year-old was badly hurt. So we have practice called Beginning Anew. There's another talk that's called Reconciliation that I gave on our practice. Basically, It's looking deeply at the part we played in any difficulty with another person, offering them things that we appreciate, spending at least 24 hours looking deeply at the part we played before we say or do anything, to not respond in the moment, which is a wonderful thing to do about dealing with anger. Then to offer 3 appreciations, what we found out when we looked at the part we played. We offer beneficial regret. And then we offer them how whatever it was that was said or done was hurtful. And that requires a lot. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. We have the other thing that anger can be useful for. It can be used to manipulate people. That a lot of people can keep people at bay with their anger. That if we don't want to deal with what is, we can just get really angry and have a tantrum. And we've learned early on that it might work at having us not have to deal with what is. So we can manipulate others. We can also become addicted to our own brain chemistry, I think. That people that are ragers, it sort of helps them to feel alive. You know sometimes maybe that there are folks that no matter what it is they're doing, no matter where they are, they're angry. And it just spills out and gets transmitted everywhere. Maybe a server in a restaurant would be the recipient, or a person on the highway, another driver on the highway. But it's just spilling out all over. And I think that I know that one thing I noticed was online that if you ever see somebody write something and then there are comments that people make, or things that, videos maybe that people have online, comments about them, and there's so much negativity that I was just amazed when I first started using the computer to see all of this spewing of negativity. And I thought, wow, people are just taking advantage of an opportunity to kind of anonymously let it all spill out. It really was, my view was validated one time when I saw that Ben & Jerry's, somebody sent me a thing saying Ben & Jerry's was giving away free ice cream one day. And I thought, I've got to see this announcement, and I want to check out the comments. What could anybody possibly say that would be negative about giving away ice cream? I just couldn't imagine. And so I did look it up online, and sure enough, the comments said, oh, yeah, right, the lines will be out the door. Oh, yeah, right. And I just thought, oh, no, they're even complaining about free ice cream. It's amazing. But that's a habit energy. It's just a habit. It's what it's a conditioned behavior. And we just need to learn how to work. Anger is simply energy. And we need to learn how to use that energy constructively rather than causing suffering for ourselves and other people. There's also justifiable anger. A lot of times we are privy to some really serious injustice in the world. And at those times we get angry. And we think, well, it makes really good sense that I'm angry. This is terrible, horrible, awful. And justifiable anger is very seductive because it feels so good. I'm right, you're wrong, I'm superior, you're inferior, that kind of thing. It waters those seeds in us that are really not that wholesome. So we need to be just observing when we're feeling that way. We are privy to injustice. We need to address it out of love for the people that are experiencing the injustice, and not fall into superiority, inferiority, any of those things with anybody else. It's simply out of love for our fellow human beings that we take action. Then there's always that somebody's caused us to suffer. We want them to suffer. That's sort of built into our limbic system to protect ourselves. Any perceived threat, we want to protect ourselves. And that's a hard one to get beyond because in our culture, when somebody does something wrong, we blame them, we prosecute, and we punish. And so that seems to be normal. That's kind of the normal course of events. The problem is that we carry that over into any perceived slight or hurt at all. And we want to not do that. The antidote for all this fear that can get drummed up in us, in our practice, it's always stopping, breathing to our belly. That the mindfulness training tells us that we don't say or do anything. When we feel the anger of energy arising in us, we don't say or do anything. And people go crazy about that. They say, oh, you're just repressing your feeling. It's not forever. It's only in that moment that we don't react in the moment. Because if we do, we find that we make lots of mistakes. We say things that are very hurtful. We cause a lot of suffering. Whenever I've asked people, have any of you ever had anything hurtful said to you? I can ask you. I see a bunch of nodding. Do any of you remember what that was said? The same nodding, yes. And the words can last a long time. Those words can go right to our heart. And that's why we need to be really, really careful about how we react. How we want to respond rather than react. And so we want to look deeply, stop, breathe to our belly, look deeply in order to understand. We want to understand ourselves, and we want to understand the other person. Thai has given us all kinds of wonderful, wonderful instructions about how we can practice with the energy of anger. He says, when we get angry, we suffer. If you really understand that, you also will be able to understand that when the other person is angry, it means that she's suffering. When someone insults you or behaves violently towards you, you have to be intelligent enough to see that the person suffers from his own violence and anger. But we tend to forget. We think we are the only one suffering, and that the other person is our oppressor. This is enough to make anger arise and to strengthen our desire to punish. We want to punish the other person because we suffer. When we have anger in us, we have violence in us, just as they do. When we see that our suffering and anger are no different from their suffering and anger, we will behave more compassionately. So understanding the other is understanding yourself, and understanding yourself is understanding the other person. Everything must begin with you. And this is a whole new concept for a whole lot of us. We like to blame people when we get angry. And when we blame, it's much easier than solving a problem. And so we don't want to take responsibility. We just want to complain and blame. In our practice, it's all about taking responsibility. I'm responsible for my thoughts. I'm responsible for my words. I'm responsible for my feelings. We take responsibility for all of it. When we retrain our minds, we can then choose. We can choose. If I'm entertaining a thought that is really not very helpful, I can choose to change the thought. This is what the practice is about. We need to cultivate our capacity for mindfulness and concentration in order to be able to use any of the practices. That's the bottom line. So Thai says, in our consciousness, there are blocks of pain, anger, frustration called internal formations. They are also called knots because they tie us up and obstruct our freedom. When someone insults us or does something unkind to us, an internal formation is created in our consciousness. If you don't know how to undo the internal knot and transform it, the knot will stay there for a long time. And the next time someone says something or does something to you of the same nature, that internal formation will grow stronger. As knots or blocks of pain in us, our internal formations have the power to push us to dictate our behavior. So that's where we get caught. We can get just pushed around by the woundedness in us. If we don't stop, if we don't cultivate our ability to look deeply, if we don't cultivate our understanding, then we're just reacting to all of the conditioning, we just are reacting out of habit. And this is what Thich tells us creates the ability for us to have free will. That otherwise we're just constantly reacting in the same way, creating the same suffering for ourselves and other people, increasing and strengthening the unwholesome karma. We're creating unwholesome karma. When we can see it for what it is and recognize it as being just habit energy, that we have been powerfully conditioned, we've developed this habit of reacting, it's not serving us well, then every time that we can stop and notice and we can choose to respond differently, that's free will. That gives us the ability to have free will. And then we start producing wholesome karma. It lets us redirect from a downward spiral to an upward one. And Thich goes on to say, after a while it becomes very difficult for us to transform, to undo the knots. We cannot ease the constriction of this crystallized formation. Every one of us has internal formations that we need to take care of. With the practice of meditation, we can undo these knots and experience transformation and healing. And then he goes on to talk about how the fact that not all mental formations or internal formations are unpleasant, that they can also be pleasant, that it can be that we've done something that we found very pleasurable, and then we want to do it again, and then we feel bad if we don't do it, and that's kind of sort of the root of addiction. That's where addictions happen. So it's still a formation coming out of a sense of pleasure, but it turns into be problematic for us. He says we need to guard our body and our mind very carefully to prevent knots from taking root in us. Pleasant or unpleasant, both kinds of knots take away your liberty. That is why we should guard our body and our mind very carefully to prevent these knots from taking root in us. Drugs, alcohol, tobacco can create internal formations in our body, and anger, craving, jealousy, and despair can create internal formations in our minds. So we need to be really good guardians of those gates. As we've talked about before, we've got 6 consciousnesses, the 5 senses, and the mind. And we are the guardians of those 5 gates. Those are the gates through which we take in all of our experience of life. And when we develop awareness, we can choose. What are we going to let in those gates? What am I taking in through my 5 senses? What am I taking in through my mind? And this is where I think it's really important to just touch at least on the idea of resentment that stems from anger that is not expressed, say. We just can put up with things for a long, long time, and as we're doing it, it doesn't bother me, no problem, no problem. I'm fine. I'm not a human being. I don't get upset or angry, so you've mistaken me for a human. If we keep doing that, over time we build up resentment and anger. So that's why Thich says, if you get a knot tied, take care of it right away. I've heard him give talks to children, and that's what he tells them. If somebody does or says something that's hurtful to you, go tell an adult right away. You don't want to leave those knots get tightened up. You want to hurry up and get them untied. So most of us here are adults, and so we probably have some knots that are pretty tight. And not to lose heart, and no matter how tight the knots are, I have found we can at least loosen them up and many times get them completely untied. That's what freedom is. Let's see. The Buddha tells us how to take care of anger, and I just wanted to quickly share that with you. There's a sutra on the 5 ways of putting an end to anger, and it's a wonderful teaching. He says, if a person's actions are unkind but their words are kind, then listen to their words and disregard the action. If the words are unkind but the actions are kind, then you pay attention to the actions and don't pay too much attention to the words. If the actions and the words are both unkind, but in their heart they have a bit of kindness, then you ignore both the actions and the words and pay attention to that kindness in their hearts. Okay? then what happens if there's not even an inch of kindness anywhere, that the words are unkind, the actions are unkind, they don't even have a speck of kindness in their hearts? Then we have to develop our compassion for that person. That's our job, is to see the suffering that they're in and develop our compassion. And then you can think, well, the Buddha's completely exhausted all the possibilities, but no, there's more. Just like those commercials. But wait, there's more. The last way to put an end to anger, he says, if you know of somebody who has nothing but kindness, their words are kind, their actions are kind, everything in their heart is kind, and you find that you're jealous or angry with that person, you need to look more deeply. You need to understand how lucky you are to be in the presence of a person like that. And I always look at this teaching as being, I love the fact that he won't let us get away with anything. It's like, you think, okay, we're done with that part. And then he says, no, but if you're jealous or if you're angry with a person like that, then you have to realize how lucky you are and learn from that person. That's the part I take away, that's a person I want to learn from. How do they do that? That's what I've been trying to do with Thai for a long time. I was in his presence. I said, wow, I need to know how he does that. How can he be so free? And that's very inspirational and very motivational. Then one of the other things that I think is important is when we do the reconciliation work, and when I talk about beginning anew, and like I said, there's a whole other video, and there's actually a book that Thai wrote, a book called Reconciliation, and I highly recommend it. It'll give you some ideas about practices. We won't have the time here to go through all of them, but developing our compassion for ourselves is critical. A lot of that childhood rage and anger can be healed. When we notice it arising in the present moment, we want to just stop and breathe, look back, maybe get in touch with that child in us and see the suffering that created that knot, and have a conversation with the child, and first of all, meet them where they are. Validate the experience. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a situation as a child where you're really seriously upset, and some adult will say, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a problem. Come on now, get over it. We're going to go to the, and you, it just makes you more angry. It's more frustrating because you're not being heard and not being understood. And it leaves a lot of seeds in our consciousness. I do a lot of, a lot of kind of mediation. I facilitate a lot of beginning a new practice for people who are in conflict. And I can't tell you how often I see that it's children having a fight, that you've touched those places in me that were touched when I was 6 years old. You've triggered that old wound in me. I've triggered that old wound in you, and we're off to the races. We're having a fight. And when we can understand that, look deeply and understand it, then we come to the place where Thai has come with his anger. That he's written a whole book on anger, which I highly recommend, because that goes much more in depth than I can go here. But he's had a lot of practice in dealing with anger, to the point where he's gone back and revisited it so often that it's just like an old friend. He says, hello, anger, my little friend, you're back again. He feels the energy of anger come up in him, and then it's just recognizing it for what it is. It's like, yep, I know you, you're back again. And we need to have a time here so I can embrace you, look deeply to see what exactly it is that's needed. So I can take this energy and use it constructively to actually be effective at solution to the problem, whatever the problem is. And it can go a long way in really helping us to heal. The more often that we do that, the more healing happens. And what I've found is that then when those things get triggered in me again and again and again, they don't have the same energy at all, that the energy's just gone. It's just like, yep, I recognize it, but I don't have to go there. And that's what Thich says. People will say, oh, he doesn't ever get angry. And if he didn't, he wouldn't have written a whole book about it. That tells me everything I need to know. So we are acting out of a lot of a lack of awareness, a lot of ignorance and confusion a lot of the time. I've had people who carry around big blocks of anger in them, and they're just reacting. Maybe they've been victimized, and they perceive themselves being a victim no matter what the situation is. And they're not real pleasant to be around. And then they wonder why people don't like them. And then they get more frustrated. And then they get more resentful. And it's just a vicious cycle. It stems from lack of awareness, that we just aren't aware of the energy we're transmitting, and we haven't gotten the tools to transform it in ourselves. So that's what our practice is about. It's about being able to really develop a lot of understanding and compassion for ourselves and for each other. Thich Nhat Hanh says, letting go gives us freedom, and freedom is the only condition for happiness. If in our heart we still cling to anything, anger, anxiety, or possessions, we can't be free. And when we're trying to deal with another person and we find that that person won't listen to a word we say, that instead of having that anger be transmitted and we take that on ourselves, what we need to do is understand that we can't force anybody to do anything. I often use the example of a 5-year-old with a carrot. You can't force a 5-year-old to eat a carrot. You may think you're in control, which is delusional, but be that as it may. But a 5-year-old, if they decide not to eat a carrot, it's not happening. So to think that we're going to be able to force somebody to do something or to change in any way we're not going to be able to do that. And so if we're trying to give somebody a message that they're not ready to receive, what we can understand is that we need to let go. Remember, letting go gives us freedom. And we can give them the message and just have confidence that we plant seeds. Sometimes a seed can be planted. But what Thich tells us is that more often than not, the seed gets planted by who we are, not by what we say. That there's no criticism, no blame, no arguing that's going to convince somebody that we're right and they're wrong and we're good and they're bad, nor do we want to do that. The whole purpose of our reconciliation is to deepen our relationship with another person. It's not to win an argument. So what we want to be able to do is, I always talk about it as minding our own business in the highest sense of the word. Come back to ourselves, deepen our own practice. If we're not happy with how the world is responding, how the world is acting, come back to ourselves. Just come back to ourselves. Take care of our own practice, deepen our own practice. And what Thich says is that if we do this and we cultivate peace and joy and love in ourselves, that 5 or 6 years down the line, something will happen. We won't react the way people expect us to. And then they might be curious to find out what we're doing. And that's the time to share the practice. Okay? So we don't need to proselytize. We don't need to hammer away at anybody. We need to do our best to transform ourselves. If we want to change the world, we start with ourselves. So, dear friends, I really appreciate you being here this afternoon. And I wanted to end with a Buddhist prayer for forgiveness, because that's really an essential piece of us being able to let go of anger. A lot of us wind up being very angry with ourselves. Like I said, if we don't control that energy in us and we make mistakes, and we all make mistakes, we all have the seeds for everything in our consciousness. And when we can understand that, we can see we have the potential for anything, depending if conditions, causes and conditions are sufficient. Any of us are capable of anything. If they're not sufficient, then those things, those maybe unwholesome seeds in our consciousness won't manifest. And so a lot of us have made lots of mistakes. I can speak personally. And when I look back on the mistakes I've made, I can see that they've been out of lack of awareness or confusion, that I had no idea what I was doing. And when I look at my conditioning, I can see that it all makes good sense, that it was just the logical outcome of the conditioning that I had. Then, when we're lucky enough to come in contact with the Dharma, and we can take good care of that energy in us, we then can respond rather than react. We can cause a lot less suffering for ourselves and everybody else. So today I just wanted to end with this Buddhist prayer for forgiveness. So we'll have one sound of the bell. If I have harmed anyone in any way, either knowingly or unknowingly, through my own confusions, I ask their forgiveness. If anyone has harmed me in any way, either knowingly or unknowingly, through their own confusions, I forgive them. And if there's a situation I'm not yet ready to forgive, I forgive myself for that. For all the ways that I harm myself, negate, doubt, belittle myself, judge, or be unkind to myself through my own confusions, I forgive myself. May we all forgive ourselves. May we all transform and heal those wounded places in ourselves and untie those knots so we can all be happier and freer and contribute that to the collective consciousness. Thank you again for being here. We'll enjoy 3 sounds of the bell. Are we off the air? I hope. Okay. One question and I answered it? That's really pretty good. Uh-oh. Oh, here's Jamie. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Good questions. I think these guys must be practitioners. Oh, I've got a book here.
It's a pillar, right?
Okay. Yep. Is it on? Oh, okay. Okay. So, dear friends, welcome back. We'll enjoy one sound of the bell before we entertain some questions. So a number of questions came up. There were 3 that were very similar about people that just don't get any better. That if we have a family member, boss, coworker who's difficult, angry, unreasonable, no matter how hard we practice and are compassionate with them, what do we do then? There's someone in my life who I have to deal with, who is duplicitous and uncooperative. How can I not be angry when this person repeats the same bad behavior again and again? And I take it again and again and again and again. So what if someone is mean, speaking and acting? What do you do with them? You can't do too much with them, but you can do a lot with you. That's the thing we have to do. It's not easy. I hope I didn't make this sound easy, because it's definitely not. And like I said, one of the main things to do is, if you have somebody who's consistently pushing your buttons, who knows exactly, a lot of times it's people in our families that know us well, and they know exactly where the buttons are, and we know exactly where their buttons are. And I know back in, I think in the 90s or something, there was a book written called The Dance of Anger, and that's what I can see so clearly, is there are dances we get engaged in that I can count on you to say this, and you can count on me to say that, and we'll be off to the races, and we might as well push it, have a tape recorder and just push the button and play it all back again, because we'll have the same argument over and over and over and over again. And we get more frustrated and more angry every time that happens. So the job of a practitioner is to be able to be mindful enough to not dance, that you don't participate in the dance. You change the steps. And it's very difficult to do, because people get very scared when the dance changes. The other person will up the ante and try to pull you into the dance. Come on now, you're not being any fun. You're not playing your part in this. And so what we need to be able to do is recognize that, to expect that, to always come back to our breath. And I think it's interesting that a lot of times, too, it's important to be looking at what is it that they're pulling up in me? What is it that they're triggering in me? What are the feelings? Can I follow the feeling back? Can I do any healing of the past? Is this an old thing that's getting triggered? Are they taking the place of my parent? Are they taking the place of a sibling? Are they taking the place of whoever it was that gave me a hard time? And I think that, sometimes when people talk about if it's in your workplace and somebody's just not happy and they're making everybody else unhappy, sometimes it's important to get another job to take good care of ourselves. That's not out of the question. However, we need to be able to use it. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about the goodness of suffering. So it's not a matter to stay there and suffer, but it's a matter to learn something. Can we use it to learn something about ourselves? And whenever we can do that, it's not been a waste of time. I also will share this with you, that this is #1 rule. I don't know if you can read that or not. It says, don't take the bait. And I use this a lot, that if you're with somebody who has repeatedly been the same way over and over and over and over, you need to be able to say, excuse me. And people are always shocked, and this is when you know it's coming from a childhood place, when you feel like you have no choice, that I just have to sit and take it. I just have to go through this dance over and over again. You don't really see any way out, when in fact you can respond very differently to that person. And I've worked with a zillion people who have done this, and I've done it myself, so I know it's possible. But it's like there was one person who I remember had a difficult parent that they were going to need to go spend time with. And before they went to spend time with them, they did a lot of work on their child. They really tried their best to calm that child. The child was absolutely beside themselves because this parent had been very abusive when they were younger. And this adult called me, and I could tell it was a kid. I mean, it was just this visceral fear of going and being with this parent. They had to be there for a week. They hadn't spent a week with their parent forever. And so I could tell that it was old stuff. And so we went through the practices to heal that child. And they had a couple weeks before they went on this visit, and they spent a lot of time really trying their best to reparent that little person in them, and to be loving and compassionate and kind and understanding. Like I said, we all want to be understood. And so before we go into bringing that child into the present moment, we go back and we say, yep, I could understand exactly why you're so afraid. It makes really good sense. Considering what you went through, I couldn't imagine you'd be anything but afraid. And I'm so sorry you've had to go through that. I know it was so difficult for you. The good news is that we've all grown up. And the good news is that we have a car and car keys now. And so we don't have to sit there and take it no matter what. If somebody starts being nasty with us, we can leave. We have the agency that we didn't have at 3. So we try to empower that child in us and bring the child into the present moment. We don't go back and re-experience trauma. It's not to go back and redo the whole thing. It's a matter of empowering the child and clearing up. Thich says at the core of any difficulty is a misperception. So we go back to clear up the misperception. And the misperception is in our body, in every cell of our body, we're responding from being 3. Or we're responding from being 10, or 16, or 40. In my case, it could be 60. From some other time, when we were badly hurt and we didn't get the love and compassion that we needed. Our job now is to give it to ourselves. So if you're in any of those situations, I mean, I can say for sure, I can look at any of these questions and do exactly the same thing and say, I can understand why you're so frustrated. I can understand why you're so hurt and angry. That when somebody just keeps acting out, and it's somebody that we have to be dealing with on a regular basis, what we need to be able to do is say, okay, what are the possibilities here for how I can change the game? How can I not respond in the way I've always been responding? What happened for this person that was a friend who was having to go back and be with this parent was that she called me up and said, you won't believe what happened. I said, what? And she said, they didn't get nasty one time. It was the best visit we've ever had. I didn't have to use any of the tools in my toolbox. So we talk about creating a toolbox of practices that you can use. I didn't have to use any of my tools in my toolbox. It was wonderful. I was so happy. And I was really, really happy because this person's parent was very elderly. And it's really nice when we can do that kind of healing before a person dies. So that was a plus. But when she said, I haven't used my toolbox, I said, yes, you did. That knowing you have one, the confidence that we get in knowing, I don't have to be here. I'm an adult person. I've got a car and car keys. I can leave. I don't have to take any abuse from anybody. And I have enough compassion for myself that I'm not willing to do that. I don't have to be mean and nasty. I don't have to get angry. I don't have to lose my freedom at all. I can just simply say, I'm going to be going out for a ride. I'll see you later. That's it. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay. Then the other questions that came up, a few words about anger at myself for not measuring up to my own expectations. Finding compassion for myself. Can you say anything about that? And that is a very deep practice. A lot of us have been taught, we live in a culture that says we're not enough, that generally any commercial that you watch is telling you that if you only buy something, you're going to be better than you are. Or if you only do the next, get the next degree, pass the next test, whatever, get the next credential, you're going to be okay. And so we're only as good as the last thing we did. So it makes sense that there would be a lot of self-hatred in our culture, that not feeling enough. And comparing mind, that we compare our lives to other people's lives, makes no sense whatsoever when you truly understand what we're doing here. There is no sense in that at all. We've all come in with challenges. We all are born into certain situations. We all have opportunities by the challenges that are delivered to us in our lifetime. We all have the opportunity, not all of us have as many opportunities, but we have to make choices of how we respond to those things. Depending on the choices that we make will determine the consequences that we experience. And so to compare my life to anybody else's life would be so silly. They're not working through the same things I'm working through in this lifetime. Their job is not the same as mine. They don't need to heal the same things. They don't need to clear their consciousness the same way I do. We all need to be doing those things, but we all need to be doing it in our own way. So comparing mind is absolutely useless. And so doing this healing of the past, and for this person who wrote this question, and for anybody else who's suffering, it's not unusual at all, then I would recommend the book Reconciliation and doing some of that work, going back and healing that child in us. Many people can't have a really hard time even having compassion for their child. They'll be critical and judging of the child. You should have known better. You should have done it differently. If only you did this differently. That those of us that maybe weren't accepted by our parents for who we are, they wanted us to be somebody else. That's a heavy weight to carry. And to go back and reassure that little person in us that we are a precious wonder of life. It is a miracle that any of us are here. We have some friends who are studying to be nurses, and they had what do you call it, an internship in the obstetrics ward. And it was so beautiful to hear them talking about how it's unbelievable what has to happen. When a person's born, everything has to work right at that moment, or you don't live. This is like, it's incredible, we're all living. And their amazement at what an extraordinary miracle it is. And that we've all survived, and here we are. And for us to think that we're not good enough, we're not human doings, we're human beings. And Thich Nhat Hanh says our job is to enjoy all the wonders of life. And if we're not doing that, we're missing our appointment with life. So that's the critical piece. And like I said, it's not easy. So if you are suffering from that, to do the healing of that kid, the other thing I would highly recommend is spending as much time as you can with people who can see your true nature. Spend as much time as you can with people who see your Buddha nature, who mirror back for you your basic goodness, because that's who you are. If they don't see it, then keep looking, because there are plenty of people who can do that. Sometimes we can't help what we are taking in. The seeds of, in the media, say, in the seeds of dissatisfaction, powerlessness are watered. What then? You need to help it. That's what we need to be able to help it. We need to be able to develop our mindfulness so we're observing what effect is this having on my consciousness. Sometimes we have a huge capacity to be with a whole lot of suffering, and we can see it for what it is. We don't take it on. It doesn't become us. We're not overwhelmed. We're able to then go and water lots of seeds of joy and keep things in balance. If we find we're getting swamped in negativity or whatever, then we have to pay really close attention and go on a diet. We need to be able to have a media diet, perhaps, and go water some seeds of joy. Do everything we can to strengthen ourselves so we can deal with the suffering we have to deal with. Is it possible to wait too long before responding when somebody's angry and you stop and don't say anything or do anything? How long is the right amount of time to do that? There is no time limit. It's possible that you may wait so long that they die. If that person dies, you can still do beginning anew. That's one of the things that gets asked very often. So it won't be quite the same, obviously, but it's kind of a unilateral healing that can happen. The longer you wait to take it up with the person themselves, I generally would suggest a week or two, actually, that's about how long it takes to get a lot of clarity. Because what you want to do is know, you want to be very clear about how much you appreciate them. You want to be very clear about the part you've played, any unskillfulness that you've demonstrated. And then, when I do beginning anew, I oftentimes like to ask for help when I'm offering how I've been hurt. I like to ask for help and say, when you said what you did, it triggered this certain thing in me, this response in me, and brought up those really unwholesome seeds in my consciousness that I've been trying not to strengthen. And I know you would have had no way of knowing that, but that was the outcome of that conversation for me. So I would really love it if you could help me out and not water those seeds in me if you can help it. Like that. But I find to ask for help rather than blaming usually is helpful. So again, thank you for your presence and your questions. And we'll enjoy 3 sounds of the bell to end for today. So thank you all so much. I hope I've given you something that you can put into practice right away. Take good care of yourselves.